A masterpiece is defined as a work of art so exceptional that it sets the standard for all future works. A work of art that can be observed and learned even centuries after its creation, because it speaks to the observer on such a personal and objectively sound level that it has to be marveled at in awe at just how intelligently and emotionally it was put together by the artist.
Oh, this is beautiful.
While there are many examples of masterpieces in human history, the Sistine Chapel, a plethora of mid-18th century to mid-19th century symphonies, we can take a more modern approach to a masterpiece, looking at tons of films like Seventh Samurai and The Wizard of Oz that have impacted filmmaking today. These examples are very commonplace and have years and years of study and appreciation from so many people around the world. In the same vein that these works of art have impacted culture around us, video games have a fair share of masterpieces that have impacted popular culture. Video games have always straddled the line between respected art and a medium that isn't taken very seriously. Thankfully, we have grown as a society and video games are now seen as the genuine works of art that they are, and works of art that can certainly rival some of the best films ever made. Video games lend to creativity and accessibility that film can never truly reach. It can connect with players on a much more deeper and emotional level since you yourself are experiencing the events of the game's story and have actual input on what happens. Video games are certainly more than meets the eye, and developers pour out so much of their own blood, sweat, and tears to create an experience that's unlike anything anyone's ever seen before. And in this medium come two of the biggest masterpieces that almost everyone can agree are heavily revered in their respective medium. Welcome to the world of survival horror, a genre of video game that focuses on strategic resource management, limited player control, and a horror-focused atmosphere that's made to give the player a sense of fear and dread. This is a very underappreciated genre and one of my personal favorites. It's a genre that truly tests the player's ability to manage resources and to keep track of their environments. The level design is very meticulously detailed. So many hidden clues and subtle item placements are what give players moments of mental enlightenment. As a player progresses through the areas room by room, players will take mental notes of enemy placement, item placement, and details in the world that are necessary for success. The map is designed to challenge the player with strategically placed enemies in the environment as well. Since movement is very limited in a survival horror game, players need to take extra caution when traversing the world. This entices players to carefully place themselves in strategic positions to ensure the best success against enemies. This genre is criticized for its limited controls, which in the early Resident Evil games are known as tank controls, where a player can only commit to moving their character in one motion at a time, referencing how a tank moves in real life. But I will always disagree with folks who say this style of movement is bad, because tank controls work very well for this genre. You can learn this style of movement, become very accustomed to it, and get great results with it. It's no different from learning a game's mechanics and using it to its fullest potential. Combining the limited movement, resource management, and clever use of camera angles in the level design, survival horror is a true and very unique style of gameplay that is responsible for pioneering the horror genre in video games. Its reverberations are still seen today. Most indie games borrow from the Metroidvania-like level design that survival horror pioneered as well. It's become very influential, but it's also become very apparent that this style of gameplay is not for everyone. So developers had to innovate. They had to expand on what survival horror could be, and this innovation led to two games being released only a couple years apart from each other. Resident Evil 4 and Silent Hill 2 are regarded as some of the greatest video games of all time, if not the greatest games of all time to a lot of people. To say these games are influential is an understatement. Resident Evil 4 is responsible for how every single over-the-shoulder style shooter works today, as well as Silent Hill 2's narrative is used as a foundation for so many stories not just in video games, but horror literature as a whole. Both these games have a monumental legacy that simply cannot be ignored, and therein lies the problem, because if a game is already so close to perfect, how do you modernize it?
That is an excellent question.
It's no surprise that the concept of remaking and remastering a game for modern audiences is very popular, and has been for some time now. So many video games are getting remakes and remasters that at some point every game ever will most likely get a modern update. But modernizing a video game comes with a cost. And that's leaving behind and changing what made the original so memorable and influential. I'm gonna get a lot of crap for saying this, but modernizing a revered game isn't necessarily a good idea. In my opinion, in order to truly be successful at modernizing an old game, you need to take what works about it and expand upon it in a way that doesn't stray away from the original focus and heart of the game. Capcom's modern remakes of Resident Evil classics are a perfect example of this very concept. So many were in love with Resident Evil 2 Remake, as was I. However, I believe that people were in love with the game for very different reasons than I was. Resident Evil 2 is still a masterpiece of a video game, even with its polygonal graphics and lack of HD and upscale textures. The reason is because Resident Evil 2 used its limitations to its advantage. The developers carefully crafted the level design to bring out details in the world that would help aid players through the world. The fixed camera angles were also cleverly placed to create suspenseful moods that would carefully guide the player from each room to the next. And the soundtrack is one of the biggest contributors to the game's atmosphere, as its combination with the dramatic and focused camera angles created an atmosphere that has so much heart and emotion in it. It's the combination of all these aspects that make this game truly remarkable, and most of the heart and soul that was in the original game was lost in the remake. Resident Evil 2 Remake focused on a more cinematic approach to its story and gameplay, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. However, the issue arises when you're calling this game a remake of the original, implying that you are rebuilding what made the original work so well. Almost everything was thrown completely out the window to the point where I cannot call this game a remake. Rather, it's a reimagining of Resident Evil 2. Now please, before you start to burn me at a stake, I am not saying this approach made the remake bad. In fact, quite the opposite. We just need to accept the fact that Resident Evil 2 is a reimagining of the original, and in that case, it has its own strengths that make the game amazing in its own way. My issue is that a lot of what made the original so good was lost when transitioning to a modern approach. For one, the music is the most disappointing aspect of the remake. There's simply no heart in these tracks, and I don't remember most of the area themes at all. Contrast this to the original where every area, every encounter has a track that helps the scene stand out. It's clear that a good soundtrack was never a priority for the remake, as it focuses more on the diegetic sounds and ambience. And if you don't believe me, look at this comparison. Here's the exact same scene where Leon enters the RPD police station. Do me a favor and see which one's more impactful. The original soundtrack was one of the game's best aspects. The music created beautifully somber, oppressive, and emotional moods that brought out so much atmosphere when exploring its areas. It gave the game such a beautiful personality that has stuck with me so many years later. There's so much heart in every single track, so much emotion and power to the music that elevates every area and every single scene. Here's what the remake did with the music. The game takes a much more atmospheric and auditory approach to its soundtrack, prioritizing spatial awareness rather than full compositions. And I would argue that while it does create a nice atmosphere, one that definitely is more scary and fundamentally different from its predecessor, it really does lack any personality and emotion that the original game did so well. Another aspect that the remake abandons is fixed camera angles. I understand that Capcom wanted to modernize Resident Evil 2, but a switch to an over-the-shoulder perspective impacts what survival horror is about. One of the biggest advantages of a fixed camera perspective is that horror is maximized through the gameplay. Limited movement creates tension and fear as you can't just roundhouse kick what's right in front of you. It forces the player to play strategically, to be resourceful about your inventory, and to maximize character placement for the most optimal results. It's understandable that Capcom wanted to evolve this concept. I think fixed camera angles are perfectly great, but the next evolution seems to be an over-the-shoulder perspective. Resident Evil 4 was the first modern approach to this method. While fundamentally different from fixed camera angles, Capcom does retain the survival horror from previous installments, just integrated differently. Leon can only move with tank controls. The traditional up, down, left, right directions remain, with only slightly being able to lean into right or left. Since Leon can shoot anything he sees with the new perspective, the developers made it so enemies can be shot in numerous places with different results. You can shoot an enemy's legs to temporarily disable them, headshots lead to melee attack opportunities, and this level of flexibility leads to enemies being able to swarm you easier. Resident Evil 4 was a lightning in the bottle mix of action and genuine survival horror. The game is more action oriented but is paced out well with genuinely scary segments and beautiful atmosphere. The music didn't even take a back seat. While it's not as omnipresent as the originals, the music is integrated well through action segments, story moments, and moments of respite. Overall, the survival horror remained intact, and while fundamentally different from its predecessors, the overall idea remains the same, just executed differently. Capcom is taking a Resident Evil 4 style approach to its remakes, which again should be seen as different and not a one-for-one remake. This is why I don't agree with people who claim that Resident Evil 3 was bad. From a remake perspective, it's not faithful at all. Almost none of the original map is retained, and the absence of iconic segments such as the Clock Tower and Gravedigger are completely abandoned. But I have no idea why people were surprised when Resident Evil 2 showed that a faithful remake was never truly their goal to begin with. These are reimaginings at heart, and Resident Evil 3 still manages to have enough heart and spirit to stand on its own as a companion piece to the original game. Modernizing a beloved game has and always will be a daunting task, and I still find it disappointing that Resident Evil 2 and 3 will most likely never get a true remake that retains what made them work so well. The absolute pinnacle of modernizing a masterpiece comes in the form of Resident Evil Remake. The reason this game works so well is because it's a perfect balance of the original game structure mixed with an entirely new experience. The level design and original mechanics were left intact, but introduced brand new mechanics, scenarios, and areas that were integrated perfectly. It didn't stray away from what the game is at heart. It didn't abandon fixed camera angles, it didn't hide any of the game's unique and quirky mechanics, rather it celebrated them and expanded upon its strengths to deliver a perfect experience. This is how you modernize a masterpiece, rather than going back on what made the original experience very special. However, Capcom's modern approach has worked very well, and has found appeal in its own unique way. The track record and fan reception has been very good overall, and I'm sure they are very pleased with the new formula. The big elephant in the room here is Resident Evil 4's remake, but I want to talk about Silent Hill now, so we will come back to that later. Silent Hill 2 is a survival horror game that's unlike any other game in the genre. The game doesn't use tank controls, and level design isn't necessarily as airtight and refined as Resident Evil's approach to gameplay and level design, but what separates Silent Hill 2 from a series like Resident Evil is its heavy focus on narrative. Silent Hill takes a psychological approach to its story, and uses themes and characters to build an unnerving and emotional narrative that can rival some of the greatest films ever made. Its attention to detail and character growth and world building is what sets it apart from most horror games even on the market today. Without spoiling too much, the game is a depressing tale about characters who deal with their own personal pain, and the town of Silent Hill interweaves each character's story together to construct an emotional narrative about loss, depression, and all forms of abuse. The game presents a very hopeless atmosphere, one clouded both literally and figuratively in deep fog that surrounds the town and its inhabitants. The disorientation in the narrative is beautifully expressed in the game's level design. The world is clouded, cold, and desolate. Areas are dim and hard to see, and requires the player to reach around in the dark to find a path forward. Its biggest innovation is definitely its storytelling. The game uses depression and pain to make you feel a sense of empathy for the characters you meet and interact with. And while the game seems to be a depressing romp, it can certainly be very cathartic. Silent Hill 2 has a legacy of being one of the greatest video games ever made. It resonated with so many people and is beloved even years later. It's unlike any experience I've ever had with a video game before, and I will never forget playing it for the first time personally. Remaking this experience is going to be a bigger and more daunting task for a number of reasons. For one, Konami hasn't made video games a priority in years. They used to deliver revolutionary titles that changed the gaming landscape as a whole, but modern Konami hasn't really focused on game development. There are signs of hope, however. For one, Capcom's lineup of remakes have certainly inspired Silent Hill's return. The series hasn't had a new game in years, so it's quite frankly a very big deal that this remake is even happening at all. The team behind its development, I'm sure, are looking at Resident Evil's modern line of remakes as a source of inspiration. The game seems to have an over-the-shoulder perspective, and the music is thankfully very present. I mean, it's hard to tell because we literally only have a trailer that's 90% cinematic. The best case scenario for me is that they can do what Remake did all those years back, which is to deliver a game that we all know and love, and just simply update its mechanics, update its gameplay, and deliver a faithful remake of the original that doesn't toss away what made it so great. Silent Hill 2 can certainly benefit from a remake better than Resident Evil. For one, the controls can certainly use an update. In fact, I don't mind an over-the-shoulder perspective in this case. However, the best thing they can do would be to update the original movement and keep its camera, but we don't have that, so there's no point in dwelling. The game can also expand upon the survival horror. I love Silent Hill 2, but it can really benefit from a remake-style approach to its combat and gameplay. Now, my biggest fear is that the music will take a back seat since Remake 2 did start this trend. The absolute best thing they can do is that the music is retained and blended in well with spatial awareness. It's possible to do both, and I have no idea why Capcom only prioritized sound rather than emotion in its music. The music of Silent Hill 2 is the most important factor. That's an objective fact, and if the remake screws it up, it will lose people forever, I guarantee you. We can only assume so much since there hasn't been any new information about the game's release since its reveal in 2022. I am very hopeful, but I will stay cautiously optimistic about the game's release. Considering there hasn't been any news since last year, a 2023 release seems more and more tentative as each day passes. Also, I wanted to make a note about the developers of the game, Bloober Team. Now, some fans are worried since the studio has only really developed mediocre titles and nothing necessarily groundbreaking. However, I just want to stress that while The Blair Witch wasn't very good, The Blair Witch is not a Silent Hill game. There is potential in the studio, and there is a possibility that they understand Silent Hill and what makes it work and what doesn't. Let's just say that they were chosen for a reason, and there is potential for them to deliver a truly remarkable experience here. The cinematics and presentation already look beautiful so far, so there's hope. I just want to point that out. People also seem to forget that Mercury's team was given a lot of crap since they were a studio that only released a lot of mediocre titles as well, and they were put in charge of remaking Metroid 2, which turned into Samus Returns, and Samus Returns blew everyone away, and Metroid Dread blew even more people away. Resident Evil 4 has been universally praised for the way it modernizes the original, and while I have not played the game myself, I have played the demo and seen almost every piece of gameplay, so I want to make a very basic assumption of what I've experienced, so please don't take this as a full-on analysis of the game. This is just my personal takeaway that I've seen. Resident Evil 4 seems to stay more faithful than the previous remakes. This game is arguably easier to modernize since the game isn't as old as the others and already looked great for the time, and still looks better than most games today. It already introduced a modern revision of survival horror that's easier to integrate into the remake as well. Capcom seems to have kept everything that made the game unique while also expanding upon its mechanics and working on what didn't work. The music, to my surprise, also seems to be retained and also expanded upon, which is great. You get a sense that Capcom has learned and refined their remaking process, and it really does show here. There's room to argue about how it turned out as a faithful remake, but it's clear that Capcom truly did give this their all, and that it remembers why everyone loves Resident Evil 4. So where will Silent Hill and Resident Evil go from here? It's only a matter of time until we get more news and footage about Silent Hill 2's remake, and hopefully it stays as faithful as 4 has. Silent Hill 2 has an incredibly precious opportunity to deliver a faithful remake, and Resident Evil has a new chance to reinvent itself once more. So if you take away anything from this video, take away this fact. Modernizing a classic doesn't have to come at a cost. A developer can retain what made the original work so well, while also keeping its charm and personality. It doesn't have to be one or the other. Resident Evil Remake proves it's possible. Now if you'll excuse me, I am going to go play Resident Evil 4 for the 100th time in a row.